Welcome to the Lighthouse Conversations, a podcast featuring entrepreneurs and tastemakers from the worlds of arts, culture, tech, and of course food. I'm your host, Hashem and Brendan. Before we get started, if you haven't already done this, please follow us in your podcast app of choice, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Remi and others, so that you get alerted about new episodes. We publish a new episode every other week, usually on Thursday. You can also listen to our extensive catalog of episodes on our website, thelighthouse.ae/podcast. I'm joined today by writer, curator, and designer Brendan McGetrick. Brendan is the creative director of the Museum of the Future, built by the Dubai Future Foundation with a one-of-a-kind building located at the heart of Dubai. I was interested to know how the museum defines the future, i.e., what lens it's using in its interpretation of the future, and also learn more about a building that has become instantly iconic, featuring exhibitions that have been essentially sold out since its opening late last year. We also spoke about Brendan's own background in design and his thoughts about the world of technology and what impact it has on us as humans. This turned out to be a riveting philosophical discussion. Brendan, welcome. Very happy to have you with us on the podcast.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
We're going to meander a little bit today, so bear with us. But I want to start with your current day job. Museum of the Future opened some time back. Huge success. Sold out most of the time. In fact, just as we were sitting down a few minutes ago, you were called to see a VIP guest, which I'm sure happens quite often. From your perspective, walk us first through what was your expectation of what the Museum of the Future would be? And what was the reality of what actually happened when you guys opened?
I should just say, so I'm the creative director of the museum. I'm basically responsible for the exhibition content, the visitor experience, and sort of articulating and providing a way for people to access the kind of future that the museum and the DFF, Dubai Future Foundation, wanted to present to the world. The reason why I took the position, though, is that prior to me getting involved, they had already sort of figured out that what they wanted to do is not create a museum kind of about the future, but they wanted to create a museum where you could sort of experience possible futures. And they had developed a kind of language for this where you went and you visited possibilities, basically. And this had been developed over years at the World Government Summit. So they had made a series of like pop-up temporary exhibitions, and they were using this sort of relatively niche field of design called experiential futures, where you kind of build up a scenario and then you introduce people into it so that they can understand what could happen with the right policies or the right kind of shifts or investment, what that could manifest to. I found that really fascinating as an approach. And then when I got involved, I suppose the main thing I learned is maybe two things I learned. The process of making it, what I learned is there's a tremendous number of perspectives that you have to somehow coalesce in order to do that, because a traditional exhibition, you can just divide a space and just assign different topics or different items to different spaces, and then you're kind of, as long as it makes some sort of sense, like visually and theoretically, people understand it. If you're trying to make an environment, though, it should all feel connected, it should all feel unified. And so that's true visually and materially, but also conceptually and philosophically. So getting to a point where we felt like each individual floor in the museum in general had a kind of holistic, unified philosophy and a holistic, unified approach to experience took a long time and was a complicated process. And so then that was all up until the opening. Once it opened, then you kind of realize that there's a stakeholder that you weren't maybe thinking about enough or in the right way, and that's the public, because the public comes in and they have a totally different set of interests, totally different set of assumptions about what they want as an experience, what they expect the future to be.
Can I interrupt you just for a second before we go to the public? So when I think today, if I was sitting there with the blueprints and I think about the future, the topics that come to mind that most of us hear about, whether, reading or on Twitter or talking to our friends, are virtual reality, augmented reality, artificial intelligence, and some shape or form of metaverse that's now become talked about, especially after Facebook renamed itself, et cetera, et cetera. were those the kind of things you were seeing when you showed up and they were like, this is how, I don't know, 2035 will look like or 2040 will look like?
Well, yes and no.
Okay.
On the one hand, I think there's a desire to provide an experience through which the medium itself feels futuristic. So VR feels like a futuristic medium. AR feels like a futuristic medium.
Correct.
The problem is that the actual lived experience of using VR and AR is actually not, it doesn't feel futuristic. It actually feels frustrating, and
Correct.
you feel very much confined to a technology that has not arrived
It's
yet.
like Google Glass or something like that.
Yeah. And so that's actually more frustrating to people than to deliver them something which is actually relying on media that are older, like more stagecraft and things like that.
And doesn't make a good user experience and probably doesn't hold the public's imagination.
No. And it disappoints them about the future.
Right.
And like the
future is not cool.
The thing that you didn't mention, but which also people associate, is robotics.
And robotics.
Everyone goes, oh, robotics is amazing. And then you watch these Boston Dynamics videos, or you watch,
like Elon Musk's
any
last
Hollywood
thing,
movie.
and you're like, the robot doesn't look that dynamic.
No, and it's not.
Yeah,
and the thing is that it's kind of unfortunate because robotics is incredibly hard. Yeah. And it's unfortunate that Hollywood sets an expectation that when you're inevitably disappointed. There's no alternative than disappointment when you see a robot, unless it's a little like Roomba, innocent thing that is never trying to be impressive.
So why didn't they go for a Hollywood version and saying like, look, this may not be the future, but this is going to be fun for you and your kids when you come and visit the museum?
Yeah, because I think that the fundamental inspiration behind the museum, because it's important to say that it's an initiative of the government. It's coming from a public interest, and as of coming from a public interest, I think that what it wanted to do and what it seeks to do is make people feel that the future matters and that they matter within the future. So something which is just like, hey, it's going to be a cool futuristic thing and you can have fun, but it's alienating to certain people because they can't imagine actually functioning in that future, wouldn't really serve that purpose. So it was necessary to try to create storylines and environments and introduce topics in a way that felt empowering to people and felt relevant to people. And a lot of those things, a lot of those technologies speak very clearly and persuasively to a certain limited population that goes like, yes, what I want is, XR and extended reality, and I want to experience the best version of that. And that's what the museum should be. But there's so many other people who, don't even know what XR is and don't care, but also, they want to think about the future through themselves and through their own concerns. And you can't throw them some kind of emerging, not quite convincing interface for them to then think about themselves. All they're going to be thinking about is what they don't understand and what feels foreign to them. So this is something that we had to avoid, and we made a lot of decisions to avoid.
So then you opened, and you were saying earlier, and then the public came, and it was huge success from an attendance perspective, from a PR perspective, certainly from just an awareness perspective. Very impressive. The building itself also caught a lot of attention, kind of the architecture of the building, the facade, all of that. So walk us a bit through the, user's experience or the attendees' experience when they showed up.
Yeah, so the building can't be acknowledged enough. Simply in terms of setting a very high expectation for what this thing could be. The building, it's a totally original form. I understand talking about this on a podcast is not the best medium, but for anyone who hasn't seen it, it's a sort of round shape. It has a void in the middle. It's covered with calligraphy, which serves as the windows of the building. So it's a really exceptional work of architecture. If you think about visitor or guest experience, or any actually form of communication, there's this notion of kind of priming people, of putting people in a certain mode of thinking before they
even
start,
come in.
Yeah,
absolutely. And it's done that very successfully.
Yeah. So people are already fascinated. They're already destabilized a bit before they even enter it. And then the lobby, once you get inside, it just doubles down on that effect. That's really essential to the museum itself, independent of what the content even is. It makes a statement for originality, for a kind of a new look of what a building can be, which is easier said than done, really, because 100%. We've kind of anyway. So there's that aspect of it. Once you enter, in terms of exhibition experience, one thing I will say, which is really shaped by being in Dubai and let's say being in the region in general, there's a lot of multisensory things which I think museums in other parts of the world don't take as seriously. So one of the big fun but long and controversial processes was coming up with the scent of the museum, for example, which I don't think many museums have a scent, but in Dubai, it's like to not have one would be like a weird choice. So these things like that, where we really wanted to make sure that, and this, to go back to your point about like VR and AR, we wanted to make sure that you were having a multisensory experience that really rewarded your physical present. And so a lot of decisions were made with that in mind.
Including taste, by the way. Taste, so I interrupt you because the coffee was like, I got a RoboCop coffee experience as well, right?
Slightly friendlier than RoboCop, hopefully, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. A little friendly.
So anyways, that's just to say that we knew when we were developing this, and this was before COVID and everything else, that we were kind of in a space where we were also not just competing with museums, I would say competing less with museums than with Netflix and video games and things like this, which are, compelling and in a way define culture more than museums in a lot of ways. So everyone sort of starts in the same way. You take in the reality of the museum, elevator ride up to the 5th floor of the museum. And in the kind of fantasy conceptual experience, you're taking a spacecraft up to a space station. And so then you depart the year 2022 and you enter the year 2071 and you depart planet Earth and you enter a space station which is in lower Earth orbit. The idea was that, as I mentioned before, we kind of put you into a future and we don't explain everything. We don't tell you what matters and why. We kind of allow you to
experience it as you want.
Yeah, and draw your own conclusions, because that, on the one hand, we want to open that kind of, curiosity gap that people can fill with their own interests rather than us telling you. But also to say that the future is it's a work in progress. Yeah. And we're not here to tell you, like, we're not forecasters telling you will be the future, and therefore, like, yeah, go invest in this company, because we know. That was never what the museum was supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about expanding what people think is possible for the future and what they think is possible for themselves or their children's lives or grandchildren's lives. So we have a lot of intentional vagueness in it, which is challenging and which is a risk. But we did that on purpose because the reality of, like, this room we're sitting in now, nothing is annotated. No one's explaining anything in this room. It just exists. So we wanted you to exist in the future without a whole bunch of explanation. And then for you to become a resident and a participant in that future.
And what was the feedback from your visitors?
Generally very, very positive, because it's a new experience. There isn't really anything like it.
Did they wind up making their own conclusions, as you said, or did they feel
case by case? Okay. I'm not going to sit here and say everybody. No, sure. Some people find it frustrating, and we have a floor which is a much more standard exhibition, which is just near future technology with exhibition labels, and it's just typical museum making. And of course, people like this because it's understandable and familiar, and it's very concrete. You look at the object and you read what it is, and you go, "Okay, I get it.
This is what this might be." Or...
Yeah, and so that's fine. And I will just say, I absolutely have deep gratitude to Dubai Future Foundation and Dubai government in general for being willing to take a risk like that, because it's easy to make a museum like I just described, where you just put futuristic stuff in there, you put a label in there. This is a quantum computer, this is a robot dog, this is a flying taxi, and then that feels like a futuristic thing. But in terms of, like, the spectrum of museum making and the spectrum of exhibition making, that's not a futuristic approach at all. That's an early 20th century approach.
Correct.
What's amazing about what we've managed to do is that the kind of medium and the message are both trying to do something new. But because of that, of course, you're going to find people frustrated. We also, didn't get everything right, and we're in a process of evolving it and all of that. But that's the nature of trying to do something new. And so generally the feedback is good. We understood that there was a certain percentage of misunderstanding that we were going to allow for, and know that would affect, people's responses, but that's also fine.
In a typical, more traditional museum setting, you have like sort of a permanent collection, and you have some temporary, things that are moving around. How much of what you have is sort of fixed and will remain so, versus, the curation, the exhibitions, the theme? I mean, the theme might change over time.
Yeah, I'd say essentially nothing is fixed.
Okay. So we could essentially come in a year from now and have a completely different experience. Maybe it's still, I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I mean, in theory, right? It's not what you're going to do.
Yeah, a different experience for sure. There is no permanent collection. That was one of the challenges, that you have a whole new museum with like 10,000 square meters of exhibition space, and you have to fill it with entirely original content that, none of which is on
And how
loan.
long does the original content typically sit?
It kind of depends. I'd say that we'll probably start working on what would be the next, a replacement for one of the floors at the beginning of next year.
Okay.
But then that takes time. But even that, though, it's challenging because what we would change needs a bit more time, to really understand what's working, what isn't.
Let's talk about some of these things. You strike me, just from doing some research for this episode, in some of your writing, some of your interviews, some of my conversations with you offline, to have a very nuanced view when it comes to that. So in terms of these big tech ideas that are coming in, the cause and effect, the consequences. Obviously, we're all excited about the future to some extent, some more than others. It depends on the person. But I think you also recognize that it comes at a price. And you've addressed this in some of your writing and some of your interviews where you talked about kind of the mental health issues, potential addiction issues that come with technology. And it's funny because we talk about sustainability when we go into long term. And then we look at some of these innovations and we say, like, how sustainable is this? That we've started off now being almost have a phone fully attached to us, which is in fact a computer. And now we're having accessories that are being added to this computer in terms of our ears, our eyes, et cetera, et cetera. What's your personal view on this and that intersection?
It's useful for people to know a little bit about like the history of how personalization of particularly computers and technology has gone. I won't say that history now, but I'll just say that if you do kind of do some basic research in terms of how computers became personal computers and then laptops and then smartphones, that process of kind of miniaturization and personalization has been very consistent and has a very consistent and sort of unified theory of how people and technology should coexist. And that is that technology should be more and more intimately embedded in our lives. And the ultimate goal is sort of invisibility and ubiquity.
Whose goal?
The people who are making the technology.
Yes, exactly. Let's be very clear.
Yeah. No, but that's kind of what I mean. The history of the work that's been done.
This is Meta's goal, Google's goal,
Yeah, Apple's goal. And before them, many other people's goals.
Sure.
It's important. And I would say, that's in general a really important distinction to make. Anything, not just technology, but anything that you encounter is imbued with the assumptions and the priorities of the people who are making it.
And can I just add here a little additional piece that I want you to address as well? You have obviously a background in design. You're a designer, write about design. So having a good user experience and better design furthers that even more. In other words, if you look at the first user experience of an Apple phone, iPhone versus today, the better the design got, the less friction there was, the more we used it. So from a designer's perspective, you'd think, oh, terrific. I mean, I'm so happy how beautiful it looks. Yet that made it even more indispensable to all of us. So walk us through how all of these things come together.
Well, yeah. So design, I mean, it's important to say that Apple in particular is a really important company because for a long time, if you talk about Silicon Valley, this was an engineer's town. Technologies were created, and then a kind of like generic box was put around them.
Sure.
Because it wasn't about that. It was about what the thing could do. And one of like Apple and Steve Jobs' like major contributions, not in any way original or alone, but in terms of the big picture, was to understand that without a feeling of human connection to this box, it's going to remain a niche thing for hobbyists, basically, which is what it was.
100%.
And so design, in terms of, product design and aesthetics and an appreciation of materiality and things like that, plays a role. But the bigger role that I think it speaks to your question is design as an expression of interest in user experience. And I think that to the extent that that's well done, and to the extent that your user experience feels natural, feels rewarding, feels fun, that then you develop an emotional relationship with the
100%.
technology.
Even at a basic design level, even e-commerce, right? An Amazon site, the better it got, the less friction. Obviously, they benefit because you buy more. My experience is more pleasant, but it probably means that I go more and more. I mean, it's the same chain.
Yeah, it is. But even Amazon at least it's obvious what it is. It's a mall in
Yes.
cyberspace. So, to the extent that it's the best one or the biggest one or the easiest one, so that's good.
Fair enough.
But with personal technology, it's a little bit different because it's trying to be a lot of different things at the same time. But what it's also trying to be is simply an extension of yourself,
Yes.
and that's why, like, when the iPhone launched, the tagline was "Your life in your pocket," and this was not a stupid tagline.
They meant it.
And just to return to your question, so design is part of that. Design is necessary for you to actually believe it. It's easy to say your life in your pocket and then have a big ugly thing that you hate, and you go, "Well, I hate my life. Then if this is my life,
Your shitty life in your pocket." Okay, fine.
well, yeah. I mean, whatever.
I get it. It just didn't occur to me, but yeah, it came from a very California perspective. You're like very positive, like your great life in your pocket versus your shitty life is now in your pocket. It's with you everywhere. But yeah,
to that point, a previous show that I made at the Design Museum in London was about California, design and technology from California.
That's right.
So I made with Justin McGetrick. And one of the totemic things that we found was an ad for the original PowerBook, so the first Apple laptop, and their tagline, that just was a single word. It said freedom, and that tells you everything you need to know about what they think.
Yeah,
they thought freedom from the office, freedom from whatever, in that Californian way. Yeah, go to the beach and work, and go skiing and work. Now it seems like unbelievably cynical and almost like crazy. But you can understand what they were thinking at the time,
100%.
And so all of that is coming from this. Just to the point about understanding the assumptions, understanding the agenda. A lot of them actually are not antisocial agendas. Actually, a lot of them are just coming from a set of assumptions where technology can expand what's possible, but technology doesn't exist on its own. It exists within late-stage capitalism and a lot of other things which affect it.
We'll continue our conversation about technology and also how Brendan found himself at the intersection of technology and design right after the short break. Welcome back. I'm Hashem Montasser, and you're listening to the Lighthouse Conversations with our guest, Brendan McGetrick. You're making case here that as a technologist or as an engineer, their job was to create technology that is superior and that gets better over time and therefore becomes sort of indispensable to us. I mean, that was a stated goal, so they didn't lie, so to speak. I mean, they were like, well, if I'm going to create a supercomputer in your pocket, it'll better be a really good one. And the better it is, the more you're going to use it. That's my job. You're saying that was stated very publicly. Fine. But weren't these same technologies well aware that there are other set of issues, very serious issues that would come with that constant exposure to technology? I mean, maybe I'm being a bit cynical, but obviously that's at the core of today's debate. And I'm not even talking about things like advertising and so on. I'm talking about just the sheer use of digital gadgets.
Of course, there's awareness of that. I would say it maybe emerged too late. And one of the things about technology and Silicon Valley in particular is it's a do it first and think about it afterwards culture, which, you can be critical of that, but it has its benefits. Of course, you'd want the companies themselves or the people in that community to think critically about it. But the reality is that for so long, tech has just had its way.
Yeah, had its way. No regulation, no discussion about any cost to that technology.
It's an unjust system simply because a certain society is obviously, or an economy is composed of multiple verticals, and technology is one of them. And for whatever reason, or for lots of reasons, it was decided that technology basically just gets to do whatever it wants for the last few decades. And I think everyone, they had the right rhetoric. It was exciting. It felt good. It felt new. It felt expanding and liberating. And it is to some extent. But the reality is that all of that should take place within a kind of system of checks and balances where you realize that if you simply allow something that basically never existed before to become the central unifying aspect of a person's life, there are going to be a lot of knock-on effects to that. And I think that, to some extent, it would be better if the technology companies factor that into what they do. But the reality is that they exist as businesses, they exist as people who are passionate about what they do. And people who are passionate about what they do want to see it have the maximum influence that it can. And none of that is unique to tech. And it's also not something to be shocked by. I mean, it's the same.
And I'm not trying to make them look like they're the villains. Certainly, I don't think that everybody out there was out there to try to kind of get us,
I'm very happy to talk about some of them as villains. I'm not, an apologist in any way, but I would say that, like, a person like Mark Zuckerberg is a very, very limited person, and he's done something very successful, and he's applied a certain kind of ruthless drive to expand, and it has paid off
very well. Yeah.
But, we are all limited. So you just can't let people who are basically as limited as everyone else, but happen to excel in a very specific but hugely influential and lucrative area of life, run the show, because their limitations will then define life, and that is what is happening.
I mean, it's not just run the show. And again, I'm going to sound like I actually kind of have also, I'm a little bit conflicted about what I think, because I was fascinated by a lot of this technology.
Mm-hmm.
And surely no one, including some of these guys, the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, knew how big this will all get. But today, it's not just the technologies and the companies they started. It's even having a very, very major impact on public opinion, right? I mean, that's a secondary effect. But I mean, it's not nothing that two of the largest media outlets in the world today are owned by the two largest technologists in the world, Bezos and Elon Musk. So, I mean, the whole thing has taken on secondary and third party effects that have made it much, much bigger. So now it's even, to some extent, you could argue that they can control the conversation. Whether they do or not is besides the point. But so that conversation we're having is based on a lot of things we read and acknowledge in their media outlets.
Yes, and I would say, to the extent that they are part of the conversation, it's also important to know that they seek cover under rhetoric that's really from a previous time.
Freedom of speech.
Yeah, because a lot of what came out of, especially the early stage of technology coming from Silicon Valley, it was really deeply influenced by counterculture. It was about how do we apply technology to expand the human experience and to kind of augment human life. That's what a lot of the early rhetoric is coming from, that perspective. And when you hear like Zuckerberg talk about metaverse, he's kind of trying to talk in that way, but he doesn't believe that.
Yeah.
And so I would say the last bit of like cloaking that these companies have is that they're still hiding behind rhetoric, which is coming from a time and a
very different time.
A political philosophy which was not, let's make as much money as possible and exploit as many people as possible. Luckily, like the metaverse and all these things are so badly done that I think people realize that whatever nonsense, like, rhetoric about how it's going to make life better, it's not convincing, but it has been for a very long time.
But how would you tackle some of these issues? Because one thing is issues of privacy and personal data and so on and so forth, which we can see, albeit very, very slowly, that some regulatory structure is going to emerge, right? So over the next 10 years, unfortunately, not before that, there will be some regulatory structure that says they can do this, they can't do that, they can collect this, they can't collect that. But then you have a secondary effect here of just pure addiction and exposure. And, people were shocked when the Chinese government came and said, we'll only allow children to use, various different technologies and games and so on for X number of hours. Maybe, I mean, I don't know if you can implement that across 1 million plus people, but maybe wasn't this unreasonable? It's not very different than, frankly, what I do with my children by giving them screen time. It seems like a very crude measure, but how else do we kind of limit that, or should we try to limit it? Again, I mean, I'm getting a bit out of your maybe comfort zone, but I'm just curious what you think as a practitioner and someone in the field.
No, I think that people should limit it. I think that it is, I think everyone, parents in particular, should be aware of how disadvantaged you are versus technology and versus everything related to the internet, and
By
understand that.
disadvantage, you mean that there's a power that's pulling you in and
Yes.
you're going to be powerless.
Yeah,
I don't think people understand that enough, by the way.
And these things are addictive, not accidentally. They're designed to be
No,
addictive.
100%.
And so that's what I mean, that like, it's not a matter of your
You're
child
weak.
being in.
He's being weak. I mean, he's been pulled in there.
Billions
It's like
and
any other
billions
addiction.
and billions of dollars, and many, many, many PhDs have been applied to make these things absolutely compelling, and to give you the feeling that if you are not using them, you are fundamentally missing out on something. There's one way that you can have a certain distance for us, because we do remember a time when that didn't exist at all.
Correct. Our generation.
But for kids,
doesn't exist.
Yeah. So I do think any limits, it's in a way, it's the same. It's not that different from like, when you ride a motorcycle, you should have a helmet on. Of course, people can go, I don't want to wear a helmet, and you're oppressing me by telling me, but in the end, it's for your good and for your family's good.
I don't get it. And again, I don't know. I don't want to be like get into conspiracy theories, but I don't feel like the conversation around technology addiction or screen addiction is anywhere near where it should be. I mean, even that word is not applied very often. I mean, we're all very careful when we say things like, I use my phone too much, I need to kind of detox for a day or two, but it's not.
But sorry, just to interrupt you. See, the way you said it is exactly the right way and exactly the wrong way to think about it. I use my phone too much. So you're blaming yourself.
That's what I mean.
Of course, I'm not saying we have no agency. We all do. We could all stop using our phones right now. But everyone needs to understand that there is so much effort and so much quality, frankly, applied to making you feel like you have a weakness and that you cannot stop using your phone. It's not like that. The thing is designed to make you want to use it, and it rewards you for using it. Like with so many things, and this, like to your point about regulation, as with so many things, there's something which is harmful that for whatever reason we are then, we come to the conclusion that it's our individual failing that we are not able to manage it better. But it's not like that. Like that just puts all of the onus on the individual, and it's sort of
as it does with any addiction,
thinking,
right? People
frankly.
feel like constantly they blame themselves.
Yeah,
they don't understand.
Or blame others. But we do need to understand that we as the public, we as people, are subject to forces that are bigger than us, and that to some extent we can individually combat, but to another extent we can't. I mean, you need more than just that.
Do you think the pendulum will swing?
I think
in our lifetime?
I think it's closer to swinging than it ever has been, and I think a part of that is the sort of emperor's new clothes phenomenon that's going on right now. I think more and more people see Meta for what it is, see people like Elon Musk for who they are, and what their priorities are. And I think that this kind of, again, this happy,
but they're
pro-social
on Twitter
rhetoric,
criticizing Twitter. I mean, it's ironic, right? It's not like they have an alternative platform. So, Kara Swisher is, and I love her, bashing Elon Musk on Twitter because that's where she's going to have her largest impact. So, I mean, it's, people are on Facebook and Instagram saying things about Mark and posting villainous pictures. I mean, it's not like we've discovered.
No, listen,
it's ironic.
It's not an easy problem, and it's not an easy problem because it's the context we live in, the atmosphere we live in is defined by technology. It's not just like it's not even like you could say, oh, books are bad. It's the entire infrastructure of communication at this point. So you can't just like cut out Twitter, for example, and then it'll be okay. No, it defines everything, and it defines the way we communicate. So it's not an easy challenge, but I think the beginning is just the kind of awareness that we're talking about. Is essential. Awareness of how things are affecting you, sympathy for yourself and sympathy for the people around you, and also a critical view of how these things are made, who makes them and why, and what their benefits are. Like how does it benefit them that you are then sliced and diced into data then sold to people, or how does it benefit them that you use your phone 8 hours a day?
Did you always envisage yourself kind of being interested in that cross-section, let's call it between design and technology, or design and innovation? I mean, you've evolved over the years. In your previous job You also looked at Global Grad Show. You were also looking at the future to some extent, very much within more of a design and culture frame. Maybe now that frame is a bit more towards innovation and the future versus culture. But you've been in that discussion, that conversation for some time now. What brought in your personal life that interest? Was it always there, present from the beginning, or was it started from somewhere, let's say, just design in the old-fashioned sense and evolved?
Well, I think the origin of all my interests is from my background, which is journalism. So I trained as a journalist, and I think because of that, I've always been interested in understanding like the story behind the story. And I got out of that field very quickly.
Yeah, I was going to say, I just figured this out because I tried to research you, and that didn't really come out. Effectively buried it.
I mean, I didn't bury it at all. I just didn't do it enough for it to matter to anybody. But no, so yeah, I studied journalism as a journalist, and then I was hired by Rem Koolhaas when I was 22 to work with him. And so I was applying journalistic and editorial.
Why did you hire you? Nothing. I mean, but I'm saying, if you're a journalist, why would you hire?
He basically hired me because they were doing a special issue of Wired magazine. He'd basically been asked to guest edit an issue of Wired. And so I was just added to the editorial team as a young kid who didn't know what he was doing, to be honest. And then that was a success. And then he wanted to make a book, which was like magazine-like. And so this was book content that we made, and I edited that. And so then it just evolved from there. So that's how I got deeply into design and architecture and these kinds of issues. With that background, what I've always found fascinating is how limited stories are and how misleading our understandings are. So like to our point about technology, one of the things that I've tried to do in various ways is show people how much more technology and how much more design is than the standard things that you hear about.
And what do you find particularly attractive about Dubai? I mean, obviously you've been in and out of Dubai now, or in and out of the region for the last almost 14 years, I guess. What do you find so attractive about being here at this moment in time?
The defining one, and it really relates to the museum, is that there is a fundamental belief in what's possible and that something better is possible.
An optimism of sorts.
Yeah. There's not only an optimism, but there's a proof of concept of that optimism, because what Dubai has managed to do in 50 years is staggering. And there's sort of no vision of the future that seems improbable, really, given what has been achieved. And I think that has an infectious quality, which feels very healthy to me. Not because everyone should be naively positive about the future, we shouldn't be, but to have no positivity, which you do encounter in a lot of places at the moment, is a dead end.
You know, what I find interesting about this is I came here just a little bit before you, 2005. And when I look at Dubai, the single defining thing is its consistency. It's a bit like this podcast, but on a much bigger level. I may have some better episodes. I may sometimes have great episodes. Maybe some of them are not so good, but I keep at it all the time and I don't stop. And they've really done this so consistently and so remarkably versus a lot of other places, not just in the region, but outside of the region as well, where it's like stop, go. And obviously circumstances around us, especially here, but elsewhere, can be very turbulent. And I feel they've just kept at it. And that consistency has served them very well and has served us living here extremely well. And it goes against the popular notion because it feels like it's a place that sort of always goes for the big projects and the big, coup. But it actually works very consistently on the building blocks, which is essentially the infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a tribute to the leadership of Dubai. It can't be said enough, really, because the reality is that it's true. The public image is like, big announcements. And,
the public image is very different than the reality on the ground.
And I've said many, many times, Dubai is so much more interesting than it gives itself 100%, credit for.
100%.
But anyways, on the ground level, you're right. It's investment in the city itself. It's investment in the country itself. And that has a material point of view, an educational point of view. And there's lots of different ways in which that is happening. And that consistency means that you have a kind of resilience that is necessary in the current, not only in the part of the world that we're in, but in the moment in history that we're in.
Well, that's exactly right. At a time when, including pandemics and whatnot, if there's one thing people crave is some kind of consistency.
No,
You want to wake up and know what to expect.
Yeah, and that's the thing. When the pandemic started and everybody was leaving and people were going like, I was like, I'm staying right here. I'm good. And also, I we talked about it before, but like for the museum, it was a really powerful thing because particularly in the creative world, everything was getting canceled and everything was getting put on pause.
The show is going on.
Yeah, for me to be able to say all that, because we have a lot of partners at tiny little studios that, you know, this was their big project.
That must have given you a lot of credibility with not just those studios, with the creative industry as a whole.
Yeah, and just to say, you know, this is happening, like, please, and I think that matters maybe more than people realize, because also the pandemic, there was a psychological and emotional component to it. Besides the health crisis, there was the mental health crisis, and a lot of that was due to the uncertainty, due to, you know, not knowing, are you going to have to lay off your whole studio? So all these things obviously weighed very heavily on everyone. And again, just to your point about consistency, knowing that the project was solid, it was going to happen, and it did continue the whole time, even during the height of like lockdown and everything. Was wonderful, because I think for me and for a lot of our collaborators, having that feeling again is a kind of hope. You're like, okay, somehow this crazy thing is happening, but somehow this museum is going to happen. Something will happen after that, and you can kind of keep looking at the horizon in a way that isn't fearful, and that is ultimately, that's the product of consistency.
Do you enjoy that multifaceted aspect of your job? I mean, you do multiple things at the same time. Versus sort of going back to a simpler way of doing things. Maybe you're just going to be a writer for the next few years. Maybe you'll just curate. I mean, because I mean, we were talking about it coming in here. I've kind of reconciled myself now to this fact that I do multiple things, and I actually enjoy it and try to embed, some creativity within it to keep me sane. But I would find it very difficult to just do one thing only.
It's hard to say. Yeah, there's a part of me that just imagines like moving to a lighthouse and like, being myself. Oh, not lighthouse.
We have 4. Which one do you want to move to?
No, I'm talking about a literal lighthouse.
No, I understand, but we can create a room for you.
On an island, uninhabited island.
Then you have to pay for the food, but we'll provide everything else. Okay, we're moving to
I like that unintentional product placement there.
That's
no,
great.
But you know what I mean. Move somewhere.
Right, understood. Yeah, and just write.
Yeah, or just think, or just read. But because this was a very, very complicated project, the museum, because like every floor has at least like 5-6 studios contributing to it. We have our own internal team. There's the Dubai Future Foundation and everything.
It's a huge undertaking.
So a lot of that was like coming up with a common language that everyone could speak, and unifying people.
And you're a spokesperson for the project to some extent. I mean, there's a lot that goes into it, not just creating and organizing, right?
Yeah. So part of me would like to just do a solo project where I can make all the decisions, and obviously the scale is much smaller and everything is much smaller, but at least it's an expression of what you can do. But this also is fascinating, not only because of everything I just said, like working with such a diverse set of collaborators, but also because of this idea that we talked about the public, because for the first time, I can make something and then see how it's responded to and then try to adjust to that. So it's actually more of a tech approach of like perpetual beta, where you're kind of making upgrades, you're
iterating.
Yeah, which isn't the typical way. Usually it's like you make the thing, you make it,
that's it, boom,
you open it, and then you realize,
damn,
and then it's stuck there forever, So that's a really interesting thing, which I've never had before. And it's kind of like tech, and it's also kind of like theater. Like playwrights are sort of like that they'll sit in the audience and they'll watch it, and then they'll rewrite like lines from the script based on how it feels. And I think that's a healthy way to look at to making things. So part of me kind of is really fascinated by that process, which is unique to the museum. So I don't know. What's next is never a question that I'm like I answer in a persuasive way, because I sort of.
Well, I mean, no, I wasn't needed to be persuaded. I was just curious about your interests. One final question for you, Brendan. You've worked with a lot of young adults and graduates and students. If I were a student today, just about to start, and interested in the field, let's just call it design and maybe even technology, but design broadly speaking, what skill set would you think they absolutely should be focused on? Because, should they be going and studying design? I mean, you didn't, right? You studied journalism. I mean, what would you advise them if there's one thing you would tell them, this is something you should try to hone over the next couple of years?
Okay, I'll answer that in a couple ways, but I would say to my background in journalism, I would encourage writing and actually interviewing, because
I feel great now.
But because
he didn't say I'm a good interviewer, but he said interviewing, and looked at me. So I mean, I think I feel like...
No, because I'll tell you why though. Because interviewing, unless it's done badly, is an expression of what I would say the most valuable quality is, which is curiosity.
I was gonna say, yes,
and
100%.
That's why you talk to people.
Yeah.
And so, and writing, what's valuable about it is that you cannot hide with writing, and that's what makes it hard. And that's what makes it
very hard.
So, I didn't study design, but I went on to learn design, and I've designed like a number of books and a lot of things. But I still do a lot of things in writing in Google Docs with our collaborators, because I don't want them to hide behind images. I always say, okay, what's the idea? Write it, and then respond in writing. And I think for a lot of people that's frustrating, but what's good about it is that, again, you can't use smoke and mirrors and go like, yeah, this is a cool looking example of like, an example screen of like our app, for example. You're like, okay, but what does it do and why does it matter and why would I use it? And these things are best expressed in writing because, again, you cannot hide. You have to actually express an idea. And if you don't really have an idea, it's going to get exposed. And I think that kind of rigor is important. So I'd say these two things, critical thinking and curiosity are the two things. And then the other thing is, in terms of critical thinking and curiosity, to apply that to yourself and be willing to look at yourself and understand what you really care about and what you want to contribute. The thing about design is that you really, if it's done well, it's an emotional experience and it's coming from your heart. And you need to understand that, because when you get into a project like the museum, where you have a lot of people who don't have design backgrounds, you need to understand why you're doing it, because they have a totally different range of things that they care about and that are also valid.
Other priorities, yeah. So let's flip that around for a second. So what do you care about and what do you want to contribute? Just generally speaking, doesn't even have to be within your current job.
I care about providing people with ways to access hope within themselves, and I care about trying to introduce people to the idea that the world and their lives is bigger and more interesting than it seems. And that's what I've tried to do.
Does the platform matter? Because I could argue that I could be doing this podcast and saying lots of interesting things, but if people don't pick it up and it's not heard or, kind of shared, then I'm not saying this is the case. I'm just making then it doesn't really matter because it's nowhere. So the platform matters, and I have to have a platform that amplifies this voice.
It does, but it does.
Does that matter to you?
Not really, because what I would say is two things about that. One is you never know what the impact of what you've done is. Yeah, like, of course, you can go, I did a TED Talk and it blew up and whatever, 1 million people watched it. Sure, that's a platform, and that platform guarantees you an audience, so that's fine. But there are also so many things that A, you don't know that anybody ever sees it, but they do. B, they see it and they don't actually realize that it affected them for 5 years. So I think in that way, worrying about the platform, worrying about the size of the audience is another form of external validation that I think in the end is a dead end, because then it's like, what's enough? But
I agree with that. It's very hard to implement, but I agree.
Well, so the one thing that's been useful for me is, so Richard Dawkins had this concept of the original concept of the meme is not what the internet version of it is. He created this notion of the meme, which is basically an idea-based version of a gene. So he took the idea of genetics and this idea of a kind of building blocks, but he said that basically ideas are kind of like that essentially you can share ideas and they have a life of their own and they have an agenda of their own. And an idea will kind of spread itself through culture and through history. It really speaks to this idea that what we're doing in all of our actions, including this podcast, is contributing to a continuum of culture, and all people everywhere at all times contribute to this. And certain things have huge influence, some things have less influence. Certain things everyone agrees is a great idea, then 5 years later they realize that was a terrible idea. But all you can do as a creative person, all you can do as a person who's working in culture is contribute to that and try to contribute to that in the purest way with the best intentions possible. And then what happens with it is not under your control. And my issue with the audience is that of course, you can start adjusting what you do to get a bigger audience, but then you end up with like what we have, like, for instance, in the States with politics, where it's like, of course, the more extreme thing you say, the bigger audience is. But like, are you
100%.
doing something of value with that? And again, that's just to what I was saying about like probe yourself and understand what do you actually care about, and then do that. And if you do that, and this I really learned, by the way, from Rem Koolhaas and Ai Weiwei, if you know that, then you can work in any medium you want, and you won't feel like a charlatan or an imposter, because you know what you're trying to do.
Well, thank you. That's I think that's a very honest statement. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Congratulations on your success with the museum. We wish you all the best in the future, and we hope to have you back.
Yeah, thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Brendan. Thank you for joining us on the Lighthouse Conversations with me, Hashem Montasil. We're produced by Chirag Desai, and our content director is Farah Al-Sharif. You can connect with us on Instagram at thelighthouse_AE, and listen to our previous episodes by visiting thelighthouse.ae/podcast. Or just press the follow button on your podcast player, whether it's Apple, Google, Spotify, or Anghami. We'll see you again in 2 weeks.